Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I am honored that you chose to spend your time with us today. I am your host, Joe Mosier. I imagine that you all listened in last week as we started this asset-light Co-op of the Future miniseries within the Pacesetter Pod. If you didn't, I would encourage you to probably hit pause here, go back and listen to that. It's a short 21 minutes, sets the stage for what we're really looking at here over the next several weeks within the podcast around what does the cooperative of the future need to look like to meet the evolving needs of the U.S. producer, but still rooted to its fundamental purpose and why it was created. And I want to start off today by acknowledging the question, maybe the challenge, the eye roll, whatever it is that you all walked away with from episode 1. And that might be like, okay, I hear you, Joe. The model needs to change, but change to what exactly, right? Stripping out the assets leaves a whole host of problems without apparent solutions. Not entirely convinced that it solves the problem. Might be some constraints within my local trade area that minimize or even negate the benefit of that solution. And so we talk about, okay, the model needs to change to what exactly? I want to do that. That's the intention of this program today and over the next couple of weeks. But I also want to name the 2 failure modes that I'm trying to avoid in this episode. The first is staying too abstract, right? I could say, the co-op of the future needs to be more member-centric. Okay, that's probably true. It's not really an answer. It's really not an operationalizable, that's not a word, operational answer. That's something you can operationalize and actually do in the business. That fixes our problem. Let's be member-centric. Great. Awesome. We can unsubscribe to the podcast. We got the answers that we need. The other, the second failure mode is pretending that there's a universal blueprint, right? That the right asset-light model for a co-op that's serving, 8 to 1,200 row crop farmers in Western Iowa, pretending that's going to look exactly the same as one that's serving a mixed livestock and grain membership base in Central Ohio. There's not going to be a universal blueprint. There's probably some universal principles, but there's not one single answer. So in avoiding those 2 failure modes, call that the boundary conditions around how we want to tackle this intellectual challenge, what I can offer is maybe not a framework, but a way of thinking about the problem and a set of honest trade-offs of looking at where this is going to work, where it's not going to work, what you need to consider. And that's where I want to take this episode and this discussion today. Before we do that, thank you as always for tuning in. A quick reminder, please like and subscribe to the show if you haven't done so already. You can do it on your platform of choice, wherever you get your podcasts. Please consider leaving us a review to let us know how we're doing. It is the best way you can support the program, and it'll never cost you a thing. I do appreciate it for those of you that have done it, and thank you in advance for those who are going to do it here in the next couple of minutes. So you all know from last week that the solution that I sort of was going towards, or a solution, a tactic to helping evolve the co-op to be more reflective of what the market needs today, is what we call an asset-light cooperative. So the question is, what does an asset-light co-op actually own in this model? Right? Let's get some kind of a unified definition around that, because there's a lot of different ways you could interpret that. And I want to work through the asset-light logic systematically to the extent that we can in this asymmetrical, right, one-way communication platform that is a podcast, right? None of you can actually comment or interrupt me here. I hope you'll interrupt me with messages and feedback, but for now, it's a one-way bullhorn. The core idea that I'm operating from is that an asset-heavy, capital-intensive profile, which is what the conventional co-op is today, has too much capital tied up in it. The investment in the assets, the reinvestments and expansions and retrofits, the maintenance to maintain them, to safety and efficiency standards. Again, the upgrades, bigger pits, bigger legs, faster belts to accommodate the grain coming off the farm, the cost of compliance and what that looks like, environmental, safety, food safety, otherwise, the costs of staffing the facilities, the utilities to power the facilities, the list goes on and on and on. The core idea here is that that kind of asset-heavy, capital-intensive profile just doesn't work. We see that in the margins. We see that in the net revenues of the businesses. We see that in patronage distributions. We see that in what gets reinvested in the locations. We see it in the final numbers, right? There are pockets. There are many of you that are listening that probably are coming off great years. Bravo, hats off. Very happy for you. But if you actually look at the cost of capital, the costs of capital that are tied up in the business, you'll see that they're actually diluting your earnings compared to other industrial type businesses. And I know we're all different and we expect different margins here in agriculture and this and this and that, but we still, it begs an examination. In an asset light, or let's talk crazy for a second, even in an asset free model, the co-op's value shifts from owning the nodes of a network that takes inputs or ag production from times and places of surplus to times and places of deficit. That's what it's doing in both directions, right? It shifts from owning the nodes of that network to owning the intelligence layer that sits on top of it. And I want to say that again, just so it can kind of sink in. In an asset-light model, we're talking about the co-op's value proposition. The value it delivers to the local producer, to the demand market counterparties, to the overall ag supply chain. It shifts from an ownership of the nodes of the network where transactions happen, where goods and services move back and forth, to actually owning the intelligence layer that sits on top of it. Of course, this is felt most profoundly by the producers, the number of producers that they serve. So in this model, what does the co-op own or stop owning and stop operating? And I'm going to kind of just go over this at a broad level. And again, it's not applicable everywhere, to everyone all the time, but may very well stop owning elevator and storage infrastructure. This could be replaced by on-farm storage within your membership base in your trade area, that on-farm storage acting as a distributed network where grain moves once, either direct to an end user or direct to an aggregation point where it's immediately then bundled and shipped off to that marketplace. And we'll talk about what that might look like. The co-op stops owning and operating application equipment and the fleet. This gets contracted to third-party operators. I know a number of you already have third-party operators and applicators. They may have been former employees of yours, right? You may have helped finance the equipment that they now own. But you go to this model where you no longer own the rolling stock. You no longer own the insurance associated with it. You don't own the head count to run the machines. You don't own the maintenance to maintain it. You don't own the storage facilities to ensure that it's not exposed to unfavorable elements. All those different things, those costs move to third-party operators. Retail input locations. This might be replaced by third-party distribution relationships, distribution partners, where suddenly your co-op agronomists are providing the advisory layer, the product sales, the product distribution, the product application is now moving into a strategic external partnership. And we'll talk about, yes, some margin goes with that, for sure, but so does a lot of operational complexity, a lot of logistical friction, and a hell of a lot of capital requirements to fund that business. So what does the co-op own instead? If we strip those things out of the cooperative model in an asset-light type business model, well, the co-op owns the staff agronomists whose primary job is the right recommendation, not bound by the menu of products that you have within your warehouses and within your distribution or your distributor sort of relationships, but they're focused on the right recommendation, the intelligence and advisory layer. Input sales, I don't want to just sort of cut that one out unceremoniously. That is a strategic decision that's probably going to depend on local growing conditions, what your regional distribution network looks like, what the uptake of generics within your trade area is. But you probably have a model where either your agronomists do not sell products entirely, and it thus resolves all the conflict of interest that we've all had to sort of work around and through for years, Or the co-op does take margin on sales, but fulfillment is going to happen through a distribution partner who's holding that inventory, who's ensuring that inventory, who's moving that inventory around. So this likely means some reduced margin back to the co-op, but that's balanced with reduced cost to serve. So that's maybe what you would own instead there. You'd own the market intelligence and grain marketing relationships, right? You still have those basis relationships. You still have the end user connections. You still have the contract structuring expertise. You just wouldn't necessarily be touching the bushels, or not all the bushels, or you'd be touching them fewer times than you are right now. The co-op would own member data and hopefully the analytical capability to turn that data into decisions to the benefit of the entire membership base in the organization. And then the cooperative structure itself, you're still an aggregation vehicle. You still have a patronage architecture. You still have a governance relationship with members where they can guide the kinds of goods and services that are available to them to meet their needs going forward through their economic and their voting rights. But let's be honest about what this requires the members to accept. So let's start with the grower who you're all there to serve. They have to accept something pretty profound, and that's that the co-op is no longer a one-stop shop. Now, for some of your growers, and as we talked about in episode 1, the larger growers, you're probably not the one-stop shop for them already, right? We've worked with boards where officers of the board openly admit, yeah, the co-op, this board that I sit on, they get 100% of my grain, but they don't get $1 of my agronomy business because that goes to somewhere else. Because they see a different service model, value proposition, talent, whatever that thing, whatever it was that caused them to take their business elsewhere. So the customers will have to confront that you're no longer a one-stop shop doing everything for them. And that's important to call out. But also on the flip side, it may not be all that dramatic, because I wonder how many of your customers only ever transact with you right now. It's a strategic partner for some things that we're looking at, that you become a strategic partner for some things and a coordinator of third-party services for others. So you're indirectly still that one-stop shop, but you do it through a network of other participants in the value chain that ultimately brings the value proposition to life to your producer. But that's a real change to the relationship and something that I don't want us to skip past. We need to recognize. So we know why we might entertain this idea internally. We know that the capital structure, the cost basis of running these asset businesses gets harder and harder and harder to generate meaningful profit, meaningful returns, and sustain reinvestment over time. It's an inescapable fact in the majority of geographies where certainly our customers reside. So there's an economic justification for this kind of a thought experiment. But again, I bring this up with the impact and the change for the members, because we can't do this divorced from what does your ownership ultimately want, expect, and believe about your role.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So that we kind of did this survey course there of what might look different in terms of what you own and don't own. So how does this play out differently by line of business? And here, I don't want to oversell any of this. My instinct is to get super granular, but I also don't really want to drag you through a 2-hour examination of the options, knowing that I still wouldn't have it be crisp and perfect. So we're going to try to balance specificity here with some brevity, and just understand that we're introducing the ideas, and would probably need to do a separate episode dedicated to each one of these to actually suss them out. And maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe we have some of you folks on that lead these types of businesses, these divisions of businesses, and we examine the pros and cons, the merits and the downsides of this in future episodes. But let's start with agronomy, because this really is the natural starting point. The asset light model fits here arguably better than anywhere else because agronomy is inherently a knowledge-based service offering. Again, removing that product sale does remove that conflict of interest, or perhaps you mitigate the conflict of interest through a distribution partner. So the agronomist's explicit job just becomes the right answer, the right recommendation for the right situation that producer is following in the field. And now, this is not an indictment of agronomists out there or any of the co-ops or the agronomy divisions or leadership suggesting that you're just fraught with conflict and you never make the right recommendation because you're solely looking at, rebate incentives from manufacturers. It's not the case, but we do know that there is this inherent tension there that does pop up from time to time. So I think it's worth calling it out. The challenge, of course, is that members are largely conditioned to receive that agronomic advice for free, right? You guys have been bundling it with product purchases for years. And so this hard shift, this hard pivot to more of an explicit service fee model is going to require a behavioral change from the membership. Of course, that takes time, takes building some trust, but it's also going to take that courage from the agronomist to stand there and say, I'd love to come out and help you out. I just want to make sure that we're all aware there's now a cost associated with me coming out and doing that. There's a cost of my recommendation, and it's going to be explicit. So that's agronomy. So grain. Grain is arguably the highest stakes bet. And it's kind of where I started thinking about this. As I thought about it, I think agronomy is probably the natural starting point. But with grain, on-farm storage expansion, which we have seen over multiple decades, and in many pockets of the country, the on-farm storage has outpaced the commercial storage footprint dramatically. But that expansion makes a distributed network model more feasible than it has ever been. The co-op suddenly in this model becomes a pure marketing desk. The basis relationships, the end user connections, the timing decisions. It can be a very coherent model for aggregating and bringing to market local production to the places where the economic benefits suggest it ought to go at the specific time that it ought to move, if the members trust it with their grain. The constraint, of course, is that the co-op loses some origination scale leverage without any of its own storage. And so, terminal elevators and processors are going to be harder to negotiate against a co-op that can't guarantee a storage network behind its commitments, right? So the first person to roll this out and do this is going to have a competitive disadvantage because there's going to be a trust deficit. One of the reasons that we see so much commercial trading in our industry is because you look down the road and you say, okay, my God, they got 6 million bushels of storage. They've got their own fleet. They got third-party fleet. If we get into a pinch over Thanksgiving weekend trying to load this shuttle, I bet those guys could absolutely pour grain on us and hit us with trucks nonstop until we cry uncle, until we filled our bins or until we filled that train. So in this scenario, you're realistically probably looking at going strategically asset light is how I would characterize it, with workhorse terminals that are on or with access to Class 1 rail. So you can still aggregate local production against those sold shuttles. You can also start to build some stocks within those same terminals to kind of have that steady outbound trucking to processors that want to have a commercial partner in their supply chain. The point is you've actually narrowed your footprint dramatically to a couple of key strategically located, strategically capability-enabled assets that actually drive outsized value in the supply chain. And the sort of smaller, hyper-localized aggregation and storage, the management of that inventory, all of that is going to happen with fewer handles and out in the countryside. Now let's talk about feed for a moment. This is probably a moderate fit, if I'm being honest. Contract manufacturing is viable, but it requires membership to have the livestock volume to support it, right? If you don't have significant livestock volume, sort of fixed demand, contract manufacturing is a model that does struggle more. So in service of an advisory model, the co-op here might focus on things like, if you can move contract manufacturing offsite, might focus on ration design, animal nutrition advisory services. Maybe there's some procurement aggregation. It's a tougher sell because also a lot of the feed mills may also have their own nutritionists. And so then it's a matter of saying, okay, what's the differentiating advantage of our nutritionists versus theirs? And so I think that's probably more of a case by case. Being honest, quality control and delivery timing are harder to manage without owning the mill. And we've seen this in every case where we've had our customers that work with co-mans on the feed side, even when they work with strategic joint ventures. You know, once you don't own the direct QC processes in the plant, once you don't own delivery timing, once you don't have someone on the ground that can comment on the status of a delivery or capacity availability, you know, now you're starting to require much more careful contractual architecture with those third-party operators, and it can be possible. It's pretty uncomfortable, and this is a high-stakes business because we all know that chickens, pigs, cows, horses, etc., they don't take the weekends off. They need to eat yes or yes. So that's why I say feed is probably a moderate fit. But feed has always inherently been a little bit of a different business, and which is why we don't see it as a guaranteed inclusion in every business model. Many of our partners, co-op partners and clients have them. A number of them don't. A number of them have increasingly looked to putting those services into a joint venture where they participate in the economic value creation that accrues back to their membership, but they're not operating it because it is kind of fundamentally so different in the type of services that it needs to provide. It then, of course, brings us to energy, which I think is probably the hardest one to run asset light. I'll be completely transparent. I don't know a lot about the energy business, whether it's propane, liquid fuels, industrial lubricants, DEF. What I do know is that fuel delivery is infrastructure by nature. And so probably the most realistic version here is maybe some kind of a buying cooperative model. You know, you can aggregate your member demand for better supply contracts that are then fulfilled by a third party rather than a full exit from all of the business. But again, I don't know if the economics there actually play out. The other question may actually be, in an asset-light model, do you want to be in the energy business anymore? Or do you cede that to somebody else? And I could envision if multiple co-ops in your trade area start to go to asset-light models, there's probably an opportunity for someone to roll up the energy business there locally and deliver some pretty effective savings through the scale that could be provided when you suddenly consolidate all of that demand coming through one channel, through one distributor that then has their one access, or their one sort of supply chain. So the likely path to implement from a purely sequential perspective, I'd say you start with agronomy. This is very simply summarized here. You'd start with agronomy, you'd prove the advisory model, use that proof of concept to establish the revenue model and member trust. Then you start to redesign grain around it, and then feed energy is going to be a hyper-localized decision. But solving this in the agronomy and grain side would be a significant needle mover. Now, the transition seems hard, and I imagine most of us are sitting here cataloging all the different ways it's not going to work. But let's hold on that for a moment and talk about something more foundational. The revenue model has to change too. And I don't think we do this topic service if we skip over that. So I'm not going to. The asset light model only works if the co-op can replace all of the spread-based revenue that is historically generated with something else. You know, the conventional co-op makes money on the margins between the buy and the sell, right? Or through the basis trade. If you strip the assets out, you strip the spread, what's left? You know, think about this. So suddenly you now have a business where the service fees for your agronomic services are, you know, for the agronomic advisory services, they're explicit, they're value-based, and ultimately they'll need to be tied to outcomes. That sounds great. It's going to be pretty, that's a hard shift. That is a hard shift because I don't know a lot of folks that are able to effectively decouple the agronomic advice from the product sale and price that accordingly. And have the courage to defend that sale because we've trained the producers to expect the advice for free in exchange for the sale of the product. Suddenly you have grain marketing fees that need to be structured around results rather than volume, right? So, well, you better offer some pretty good risk management solutions. They better be sophisticated enough to generate some outsized returns, but not taking so much risk that you collapse the balance sheet of this kind of virtual asset-free or asset-light co-op. So that's going to be a very different way of transacting. You might have some retainer relationships with members who want ongoing strategic access to their agronomist, to a grain marketing advisor, to a nutritionist. But that, a retainer relationship with the producer, that's interesting, but that's pretty different. And different is often uncomfortable. And then suddenly you have patronages fundamentally redesigned around value created rather than bushels handled. So if you're pricing everything on the value, not on the volume, what does that do to the economic benefits, the economic rights that your members have of the co-op? The uncomfortable reality is, most members still resist paying explicitly for advice that they're conditioned to receive implicitly. Right? And this isn't a fatal problem, but it's a real one. Maybe this helps us all break through that wall of charging for the value that we deliver. But a co-op going asset light without solving the revenue model first isn't likely to survive the transition, which is why I think it's important that we raise it here. It's one thing to make ourselves to see how we pencil out the math, that this makes economic sense for the business. It's okay to think about, can we develop the trust with the producer to come along on the ride with us? But then ultimately, how does this change the way we charge for those services? And what's the benefit back to the producer? So none of them are reasons to abandon the thought experiment, because I predict at some point co-ops will fundamentally need to become pure service organizations in a way that we're all going to have a hard time operationalizing in our heads right now. But this is a necessary thing for us to proceed with. We're going to come back to this in a couple of weeks when the transition question gets its full treatment. So this is more of a teaser as opposed to the full entree. So last week we talked about the case for change in the cooperative business model, one that I feel more every day is not a possibility or even a probability. It's an inevitability. And after today, we have a blueprint, albeit imperfect and context dependent, but specific enough for us to work with and react to. So next week, we're going to take this a step further, and I want to think about the implications of this model at the point where it's most fragile and where the make or break outcome is determined in practice. And it's nothing we've talked about so far. It's not the asset cost, it's not the partnership network, it's not the value-based pricing, it's not the economic benefit back to the grower. It's not the model, it's not the structure, it's the people that will be needed to run this business and to sustain it. And that's where we're going to go next week. Thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate you being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and your commitment to turning strategy into outcomes in your agribusiness. Thanks for being on this journey with us, and I look forward to having you join us next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.